Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Valley podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Jack Bull and James Valliant, and we're going to be talking about the new chronology, redating Paul's epistles. And we're also going to be talking about the Marcionite collection versus the canonical edition of Paul's letters. And that being said, Jack, James, thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Great to be here, as always.
So, Jack, I hear that you got a new book out that you and Marcus Vincent, Mark Bilby have been working on for quite a bit.
Yeah, indeed. And hopefully it'll be the source of a lot of the conversation we have today. So for anyone that's at all familiar with Marcus Vincent, myself, and Mark Bilby, you'll all know that our big shtick is Marcion, the Epistles, the Evangelion, the First New Testament, all that sort of jazz. And the attempt, at least the attempt, hopefully the successful attempt, to redate some of these New Testament texts and push the canonical versions that we have to the 2nd century rather than the 1st. Controversial, I know. But, you know, as someone once said to me, if Marcus Vincent was told the sky was blue, he tried to argue it was green. So we're beginning from that as a position. But a lot of what we talk about today will be premised on the research that the team has been doing for the last 5 years, which has culminated in the fresh reconstruction and translation of the Epistles, which Mark Bilby published yesterday, I believe, on Amazon, which Marcus Vincent and I edited, based on the reconstruction that Marcus did for our upcoming 3 volumes on Marcion and the New Testament, which coming out with Na Franca, probably in spring for those who are English readers, but for those who are Greeks, for those of us that are Germans, it's already out, or out very soon. I think he was on your channel just the other day advertising that as well.
Yes.
So everything that we're talking about today is been published, peer reviewed. I know people love that phrase, and hopefully is at least, if not going to convince people, start a conversation. And so hopefully over the next hour or so, we might begin to explore some of those topics and why we have come to the conclusion that we have.
So the first thing I want to do is to give a brief recap to the audience of who exactly is Marcion.
Yeah, so I'm actually just writing a book at the moment called The Heretics, and it's a co-edited volume which won't come out for ages, so I'm not going to plug that one here. And it's interesting because as I was writing the introduction to this book, it dawned on me that unfortunately, so much of what we know about people like Marcion only come from his enemies. And as we often know, our enemies don't always do us in the greatest light. And so what we know about him comes exclusively from them, and we should take that on board. But a few things we can say for certain. He is from North Africa and was raised in some form of Christian household, probably, and comes to Rome, where the hustle and bustle is, where the great excitement of the new Christian faith is beginning to pop up. And he is around figures like Justin Martyr, who all of your viewers should be familiar with because you cannot get away from him. And he starts his own school, his own ideas, and promulgates his different theology. And it's centered mostly around the apostle, who he thinks is Paul. And he's the first person to publish a New Testament. And there's a great article by Wolfram Kinzig all about this. And Kinzig argues that until Marcion, we actually have no evidence of a New Testament or a collection of Christian canon. And so Marcion, irrespective of whether we think he's the first, second, last to promulgate a collection of books, he's no doubt important because we don't have this term New Testament before him. And his New Testament is made up of an antithesis, which he writes himself, an evangelion, or gospel, which is a bit like Luke, with some parts redacted, and an apostolos section, which is the letters of Paul, or as we call it, the pre-canonical 10 letters of Paul, because it omits the pastoral epistles of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, as well as Hebrews. But, I mean, if you still think Hebrews is written by Paul, we can't have a conversation yet. So this is the person, and he comes into immediate conflict with the people in Rome, particularly with Justin Martyr. There's no doubt that they disagree on their theology. And although Justin is pretty scathing about some of the things that Marcion believes, and certainly doesn't like it, there seems to be a respect, if not an agreement on the core principles of Christianity, Justin seems to include him in the term Christian and writes to him in the Greek pros to Marcion. And that might seem like a nothing in and of itself, except for the fact that subsequent authors, namely Irenaeus and Tertullian, are going to write kata Marcion against him. And so there's a shift that happens after Marcion dies where he becomes heresiologized. People begin to talk negatively about him and condemn him for what he believed. Again, I'm not saying that Justin necessarily agreed with him. He almost certainly didn't. But after he dies, there begins this rhetoric that's more condemnatory and slurs begin to be thrown around. But Marcion is a bigger figure, not just because of his New Testament, but also because of the seismic waves I think we can show that he makes in the early Christian communities. There are many early Christian heretics that are wandering around, one of which is his former disciple Apelles. But Apelles never attracts the same sort of attention that Marcion does from subsequent authors like Tertullian, Epiphanius, and so on. And the reason for that is because he probably had a minor sect, probably in Rome, that attracted some people, but ultimately didn't make much of an impact. But Marcion seems to be much bigger than that. So much so that people are writing volumes upon volumes against his work, against his character, commenting on his texts. And so I think that he is, in some sense, the most significant figure of the 2nd century that we have no actual writings of, or from, I should say, because it won't have escaped any of your listeners' notice that we actually don't have any extant manuscripts of Marcion, and what we have of him has to be reconstructed. So I think that for that reason, he becomes, to my mind, the most significant figure in the 2nd century, like I say, that we have nothing from directly, only through 2nd century sources.
And how many letters did Marcion have in his edition of Paul?
So he has 10. And the 10 that he has are, like I say, the ones that scholars went on a bit of a journey with the Pauline epistles. They first reject Hebrews, then they reject the pastorals, then they just get down to the 7 that the majority of scholars accept today. And Marcion seems to have been the first on that scholarly journey in some ways, that he rejects Hebrews, whether he had it or not is up for discussion, and he also rejects the pastorals, and he leaves us with 10. And these are largely the 10 that are in our New Testament canon, except for the fact that sometimes large sections are omitted. And what's fascinating about this, and this is what I think viewers would value or benefit from by buying our new reconstruction or Mark's reconstruction translation, is to see what bits are omitted. And we might come into some of those in a minute. But on a more broad scale, his collection first interested me because of the differing of the order. One of the things that I always found utterly peculiar about the ordering of the New Testament texts is it begins with Romans. And you're like, well, okay, that's nice, but Romans is neither the first letter that he wrote, nor the first attested. So why is it first in our list? Answer, because it's the biggest. And to me, that seems like a bad way to order texts, right? Which one's the biggest? And Marcion's order is slightly different to that. It attempts to be chronological. Well, that's a pretty sensible order to put something in chronology. And so not only are his texts different in their content, different in their length, different in their style and lexic and purpose, but on the basic level, they're different in terms of their ordering. And I think that in itself is significant, and was, like I say, one of the first reasons that I came to it.
I wonder about that. We start with Galatians in the Epistles edition, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And is it really, can we really be solid in saying that Galatians comes first, say, before 1 Corinthians or 1 Thessalonians or something like that?
Well, I think that when we're dealing with letter collections, we must be already on the front foot in being careful with our methodology. Because when we're dealing with a collection, we're already dealing with not the first texts. Now, no one's saying that just because we gather things together, we've interpolated it and corrupted it. But nobody writes a letter as part of a collection, right? Like unless they're forged from the beginning, and we can have that conversation as well. But I mean, when we open the collective works of Shakespeare, it was never the case that you would read Romeo and Juliet into King Lear. That'd be a confused, muddled story. And so, again, like I say, I certainly think that whoever collated these texts certainly had a concept in mind of which ones he thought was first. Now, again, we can argue about whether Marcion collected them, whether he inherited them, whether he actually played with these texts, as Tertullian accuses him of, perhaps. But certainly, I think, from the mind of the collector, this was the order he thought they were in. Now, there is some confusion there because we do get Galatians first. And as you say, having 1 and 2 Corinthians together might also seem peculiar. But either way, I think at least an attempt at chronology is better than which one the biggest and ordering them in that sense. That seems to me the worst way. But yeah, I mean, we could argue about dating, but certainly to my mind, I think that the author, or the collator, at least tried to put them in some sense of chronology.
So are the letters in general significantly shorter than the canonical version of those epistles?
So it depends on which one we're looking at, ultimately. But we have recently on the Patristica YouTube channel gone through 2 Corinthians. And my goodness, was our episode eye-opening to me. I don't look at these texts as much as Mark and Marcus do. But I did edit the first Apostles translation and the second one. And one of the things that hits hard is that sometimes they are, for large portions, very similar. But in 2 Corinthians, there is this massive portion of text that's missing. And what's incredible about it is that although they miss so much of these middle portions, where the two come back together, they are completely coherent. And so I'm just trying to get it up here so I can find it for your viewers for reference. So
Sure.
If we go to chapter 6, and again, you have to buy the reconstruction, you have to take my word for it for now. If you go to chapter 5, verse 6, we have our last line there from the 2 Corinthians Marcionite version, basically, until chapter 7. And then from chapter 7, we have to wait all the way until chapter 11 to get anything back again. So you've got a huge amount of text missing in 2 Corinthians, most of which is waffle, I might add, complete gobbledygook, which is a real feature of the canonical redactor. And yet, in the Marcionite collection, it makes complete coherency from chapter 7 and then rejoining back in chapter 11. And when you read it like that, what you realize is that chapters 8, 9, and 10 are, like I say, are absolute waffle and tend to include what I call story time. And again, you know, Marcus and Mark tend not to include my slang in their great scholarly works. But I think that the term is pretty important. One of the great features we find in the canonical version compared to the Marcionite text is this great propensity to tell story and include extra characters, secondary or otherwise, people like Titus or Timothy, or the all of the co-authors like Sosthenes, whoever else might be writing with Paul, as well as repetition. Canonical Paul, I tell you, he's so repetitive. I mean, he just says the same thing again and again in 2 or 3 different ways. Marcion's Paul doesn't do that. And the fundamental difference, I think, of why these two things happen is because one set of texts is a homily and the other is an academic discourse or something along those lines. Marcion's text is the work of a scholar, the work of someone trying to make a series of arguments, one after the other, that is logical and coherent. Canonical Paul is a sermon, it's a homily, it's a preaching endeavor to try and convince people of different theologies, thoughts, and ideas. And that's why he has these doublets, these repetitive elements. And when you then deconstruct the two and compare them side by side, it's with such a surgical precision that these things are omitted or added in. Right? It cannot be an accident. Marcion, or whoever did a redaction, if we are believing the traditional consensus, could not have done this by luck or just based on theology. There are so many extra elements that go into this. One of the telling grammatical things that struck me. We gave a paper on it in Chicago this year, was when we looked at the words and the type of words that each collection is using. And in the Marcionite version, we had these beautiful word maps. They were very nice. And the biggest word in the middle was the definite article ho, just meaning the, and other definite articles surrounding it, followed by lots of nominative nouns. So the subject of sentences, this thing is this and that thing is that. And so it was clear that this was a text about things, describing things, going into theology, discussing stuff. But when we hopped over to the canonical version, we saw lots of things like der, which means but or however. We saw things like you or you all, humon, etc., and we. It was a dialogue text, a pedagogical text. It was one that wanted to speak and interact and discuss with people. And this is so different. How can you get two texts that are so different, not just in theology, but style and intention and length and order and all those sorts of things that cannot be accidental? So that's some of the things that differ between the two, I think, that at least hit me first.
And does it also come across differently with the way that Paul talks about Jesus and Jesus Christ versus in the canonical text?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is definitely a different figure. I mean, one of the great differences between Marcion and the proto-Orthodox or proto-Catholics like Irenaeus and Justin is this belief in the incarnation, which Marcion rejects. And that's a really pivotal point. I mean, any theologian now will tell you the significance of the incarnation in Christian theology. And Marcion rejects this and thinks that Jesus descends into Capernaum, as his gospel says, which is the 3rd chapter of Luke, essentially, just out of the sky. And even his apostle, actually, his disciple, who I mentioned earlier, Apelles, eventually comes to reject this in Marcionite theology, although he also rejects the incarnation too. He thinks that Jesus did have flesh. But anyway, so yeah, the Jesus Christ is very different between the two texts. But that sort of Christology, I think, I'll leave to Marcus and Mark to talk about.
And what about a text like Galatians in the Marcionite edition? Is it nearly as large as the canonical edition, and are the argumentations in that text similar to canonical Galatians?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm looking at Galatians here. I mean, chapter 1 largely the same, chapter 2 largely the same. But again, notice like the dialogue story time elements are gone. So, for example, this verse is indicative of the canonical redactor. Next, after 3 years, I came up into Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and I stayed with him for 15 days. But another of the apostles I did not see, except James, the brother of the Lord. We're all familiar with this passage. That's gone in the Marcionite version. So this is the sort of story that sort of starts to happen, right? And we go to chapter 2, and this again is the fine tuning, I think, of the canonical redactor. And following 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem. Okay, fine. But the canonical redactor adds, next, following 14 years, again, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas. It's adding more characters into the story, taking along also Titus, adding characters. It's bringing people in. So yeah, although the bulk of it might seem like we're going to keep the majority of the story, we're constantly getting these acts-like narratives that are interspersing our Paul conversation, our Paul discourse. And like I say, if we take those out, Paul completely makes sense in the Marcionite version. Again, if I just read those that connection to you, he says just at the end of chapter 1, to reveal Christ in me so that I may evangelize him among the Gentiles, I consulted not with flesh and blood, nor did I come into Jerusalem. And following 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem, right? So for that section, he's not there. And then following 14 years, he does go up to Jerusalem. So the Marcionite version can continue to make sense as an internal story without these constant interruptions by the canonical author. And the canonical redactor is not only making story time, he's also including more liturgical language. He's making more references to things that the proto-Orthodox might recognize, people like Irenaeus in particular. So, you know, for Galatians, it is a lot similar, but again, with some of this repetitive and story time nonsense taken out of it. Although saying that, looking at chapter 3, behind me is pretty empty as well.
Some scholars argue that the canonical editions of 1 and 2 Corinthians were multiple letters that were spliced together. Is that same kind of evidence exhibited in the Marcionite edition or not?
I don't see I think the confusion around 2 Corinthians is solved by Marcion. Personally, I don't know what Marcus and Mark's view of that is, but this desire to see 3 or 4 letters coming together and to create an amalgam of epistles, I don't think presents the same issue. Although I do think, and this is significant, that what we have called Deuteropaul, so 2 Thessalonians, Corinthian, Colossians, and Ephesians, that problem is still present. And does need to be addressed, but no, certainly with the Corinthian problem, I think that is largely gone, and I think that's why there's been so much confusion. And the question is, for my mind, is like, has there been several redactions to this? Is there more underpinning it? And perhaps Mark has the data analysis for that, computational wise, which I haven't seen yet. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case to my mind that it's solved.
Do you think that the canonical, just for the viewers to understand your approach, you think the canonical Paul is aware of gospel material happening at the same time as our canonical gospels are basically happening? Or what is the temporal and causal relation between our canonical gospels and our canonical Paul, assuming Marcion's edition of Paul is more authentic?
Yes, this is where I get really excited. So this is where we come into where I'm at, right? This is where I'm spending a lot of my time nowadays, because I'm firmly of the opinion that the canonical texts, and I'm not including just Paul here, come together, right? And I don't think, again, it's exclusive to canonical material. And the reason why I say this is because what we have, and again, this is all Marcus's 20 years of work. He wrote a book, Marcion and Early Christianity, and the Resurrection and Early Christianity. And both of these things showed that there is a pre-Marcionite rhetoric, which is fairly, I would say, disconnected. So, for example, we might look at the short recension of Ignatius and the Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. There's no great link between those, although these two authors apparently knew each other. But yet, somehow, after Marcion, lots of texts begin to read almost identical to one another. And you're like, well, that's a bit of a coincidence. And so I think that what's going on is that in a post-Marcionite world, and maybe even in a post-Justin Martyr world, perhaps with Irenaeus or other of his school, there begins what I call the Great Cleansing, where texts begin to be rehashed so that they can form one cohesive meta-narrative. They see around them the texts of heretics, of Valentinus or Basilides or Marcion or Apelles or whoever it might be, and they say, right, this needs to be uniform. This is a problem for us. And so this is why people like Marcion, why Irenaeus put such great emphasis on the 4 Gospels, like the 4 winds. Not a meteorologist, even if he was a bishop. And in England there are many winds, and I think that, again, this is not exclusive. So I think that we can see, for example, that the middle recension of Ignatius, and this is why I think he's so critical in this conversation, is parroting Paul and Gospels. The short recension is not parroting Paul and Gospels. So too with Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. It's why I date it so early. If Polycarp is familiar with all of these great theologians, like Paul, why does he not quote him? Why does he not know him? So too with bits of Clement. So too with the Didache. It's like, okay, we have the Didache. or even Justin Martyr. Why do these people not talk about Paul in the way that we do? Why is it that all of a sudden with people like Irenaeus and Tertullian and Origen, does the narrative shift? Well, I think it shifts because they're trying to create a meta-narrative to try and flush all these texts together. And people might say to me at this point, well, and this is what we get all the time in the comments of our YouTube videos, this is speculation, there's no evidence of this. Okay, well, look, I am partially on board with that as a criticism. I hear the fact that we have no manuscript data for Marcion. I hear that as a big criticism. My problem is that, and this is the title of this video, Redating Paul's epistles after 70 AD. I don't know what proof you can show me that Paul was writing before 70 AD. Because again, I have no manuscript data of that. Surprise to all the evangelicals at home.
Exactly.
Second, I then want to find evidence of Pauline theology, because that's the next logical step, right? Fair enough. Okay, well, who am I going to look at? Well, let's look at the text I just mentioned. Well, it's not just the case that people like Ignatius and Polycarp and 1 Clement don't quote Paul properly. Sometimes they actively contradict what he's saying and miss the entire point of his theology. Again, all of this stems from Marcus' book about resurrection. Paul, wherever you find Paul, you find resurrection. Well, in the short recension, Ignatius doesn't know what the resurrection is, he's asked from his elbow. So too in Polycarp. So too in 1 Clement, the resurrection is a footnote. So again, I'm now searching for Paul. I'm looking in these early Christian texts. Okay, I'm now up to about 130. No Paul. And you can then say, well, why would people have received him? You know, they might not have his letters on hand. Maybe that's what they're a bit hazy on that. Yeah, fine. They can be hazy, but they can't contradict him. They can't ignore the key theology. Another small example, and this is quite petty in some ways, but Paul says about slavery in the canon that if you can get freedom, you should take it. That's pretty good advice. I rate that advice. I'm here for it. But Ignatius of Antioch, he's not here for that. He says if you set a slave free, they'll become lost to their own lust and be destroyed. I don't know, man. I'm not saying that's a big theological difference or it's going to break the bank in terms of apostasy, but it is a strange thing to say if you value Paul.
But Ignatius does, even in your short version of Ignatius, original version of Ignatius, doesn't he attest to the existence of a Paul?
He does, and names him
Just
after
as
Peter.
with First Clement, doesn't he attest at least to the existence of a Paul, even if there might be variances with the letters?
Agreed, absolutely, and that's fine. And clearly he knows Paul, again, only as a letter to Peter, because he names Peter first, and I think that's because he values Peter first. But again, he doesn't know 1 Peter or 2 Peter. Why not? Surprise! There is no 1 Peter and 2 Peter. What are you talking about? And everyone recognizes that, right? No one hangs on to 1 and 2 Peter still. Well, I say no one, I'm sure people do, but at least 2 Peter we can probably agree, right? With most people, even the fundies. So this is a problem for me. And again, he knows Paul by name. How would he not know his theology? At bare minimum, the resurrection. Maybe at bare minimum, the story in Acts. Why does he not know any of this stuff? And in the Middle Ascension, well, blam! All of it comes to the forefront. The man's a Pauline expert. And this is true for 1 Clement too, right? Again, 1 Clement's attestation of the resurrection is a footnote. I mean, John Paul II would be spinning in his grave because he says we're a people of the resurrection. These guys weren't. These people aren't people of the resurrection. They're people of the crucifixion. That's important. And I think that's why I believe the crucifixion happened, despite the claim of mythicists and others. One thing that seems to be a general consensus in the early church is the crucifixion happens, but not so much the resurrection. And again, I'm not saying they don't believe in it. I'm not saying that. But what I do think is that it's not the crux. So we're now moving forward in time. We've got no evidence of Paul particularly, or the Gospels for that matter. And then, kablamo, Marcion comes along, produces a Pauline epistles, and then they seem to flood the textual data that we have. And this is, regardless of what one believes, whether they agree with us on the Pauline epistles, is striking. And I think the burden of proof is not on us to show that Marcion has an early version per se. It's to show that we can date Paul to the 1st century. Because I'm waiting. I'm here for it. If you've got the evidence, I'm waiting. But I don't know where you're getting it from. Now, again, I would reiterate that the precision of what would have to have been done by a Marcionite redactor from the canonical epistles is basically only capable through AI or a team of hundreds of experts, because the precision is too great and too silly in some occasions. And I'll give you one example in just a second. Whereas one can easily see how we could get from a shorter text to a longer one, because what we've done is just repeat ourselves and add in theologies that are more in line with later 2nd century thinking in a post-Justin Irenaeus world. The example of the benign nonsense, though, that we can maybe see in terms of redaction is with the great word ade, which means already most of the time. And this word already, I mean, it's a nothing word. It's what I call a benign word. It does nothing for you. It doesn't have a theological purpose, an intent, a practical significance. In the same way in English, just means already. And it appears 60 odd times in the canonical version and does not appear once in the Marcionite version. How has Marcion removed the word already from his text 60 plus times with such precision? There's no reason for it. And we can find this again and again and again and again with other types of words. So even if you reject our base principle of, Marcion into canonical and you still accept the traditional consensus, you're still yet to prove it's 1st century. I think you're a long way off, actually.
And where I definitely agree with that is that regardless of which text came first, there is no evidence that Paul's letters predate 70 AD anyway. To your point. That's still a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to, I mean, I'm sure that the team, one of the great things about our team, for those of you at home that don't know us, I mean, we have the granddad, the wonderful Marcus Vincent, the seasoned scholar in the field who, isn't outwardly religious. We have Mark Bilby, who I think would identify as Christian in some sense, and then me as a traditional Catholic. So we're coming at a place of 3 extremely different perspectives, and the team disagrees on a whole range of other stuff to do with the Pauline epistles. And this might be one thing where I speak for myself and not the other 2. I do think that some of this Pauline material is early. I think that some of it is 1st century, and that's speculative, that's hypothesis, and that's, I'm really clear about that. But the idea that the epistles are, that the canonical epistles are, I think is for the birds, and not just because of Marcion, but because of what Jacob said, right? Is that you can't show me where Paul is in reception, you can't show me where Pauline theology is particularly significant, and ultimately, apart from the story of Acts, which we know is bunkum, and even contradicts the epistles of which they seek to justify the story they tell, it contradicts it. And that should strike fear into the heart of scholars. I was at a conference 4 years ago when we were sort of beginning this journey together as the Patristica team. And the dismissal that I received from certain colleagues, lovely colleagues, went for beers afterwards, no animosity, everyone's a lovely person. But was so striking. You just think they just dismiss it out of hand because we're just told the same discussion all the time. And even among critical scholars, I mean, even on your channel, Jacob, I remember I discussed mythicism with someone on your channel. And I brought this up. And, if you're a mythicist, nothing is obvious. I mean, to the skeptic, nothing should be obvious, right? Everything should be questioned. But yet there was a complete refusal to acknowledge that maybe the consensus on the Pauline epistles could be wrong. So we need to sort of begin to at least affect change in the way that we're approaching these things and have a different methodological outset, a different methodological view from the outset. And that's been the great learning curve of the project, not only with Paul, but also the Gospels, the Apostolic Fathers, and others, is that our methodology is the first place that we start, whether consciously or subconsciously. And if we just accept the scholarship of our forefathers, Lightfoot, Zahn, Harnack, whoever it might be, I guarantee you these guys, they're great and I value them, but they're not infallible. And you'd never get this in science, right? You'd never say, well, you put a toad under your bed in the 1500s, that cured the cold. Let's do that again. We move past that. But yet, for some reason in our scholarship, even among the non-Christians, the secular scholars, there's this mindset block because of the way in which they were trained.
What is the significance of Polycarp and Justin Martyr when our evidence starts really kicking in, or mysteriously not fully kicking in? Obviously, later they're going to have the full-blown Paul, and we have a nice attestation. But Polycarp seems to attest to our canonical Galatians, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by attestation. I mean,
that's what I'm asking.
there is probably one of the single greatest works of scholarship by Barnett, 1949. I think he publishes a book called "Paul Becomes a Literary Influence." It's a book I came upon by mere chance during my PhD and passed over to Marcus, which I know has been his Bible, forgive the pun, over the last couple of years. And what Barnett sought to do was such an incredible, honest piece of scholarship. He just said, look, here's all of the attestations. And he didn't give this absolute, I almost swore then, this absolute frustrating categorization of quotations, echoes, and allusions. That sort of rhetoric drives me nuts. And what he did, but he just said, look, here's all the times where I can see in any way an influence of Paul in the Apostolic Fathers. Now, what he's not doing there is questioning his methodology in terms of the ordering of the texts. He's not saying that maybe Ignatius or Polycarp or Clement could have influenced Paul. He's assuming that Paul must have influenced them. And I'm okay with that. We can give him a buy. It's 1949. Everyone relax. But one thing that I've noticed is that, to my mind, I think canonical Paul is sometimes using Ignatius to construct his text. Now, I'm not at all saying that, again, I think some of Paul is first century. So it's perfectly possible that we can find allusions to Paul in Polycarp and Clement. What I'm saying is that we don't have evidence of the canonical text as is the final product. Okay, so we might have a reference or an allusion to Galatians, but it's not the canonical text. We've got to be really careful how we refer to that. And again, that line might seem identical in the canonical text, but that doesn't mean that he has the canonical text. It means he has a version of Paul that we don't. And that's a distinction maybe that I wasn't clear about earlier on, is that things might be Pauline, people might have it, but that doesn't mean it's the canonical text that they have. Perhaps an easy way to understand this is for those of you that know the work of Papias. He mentions the Gospel of Mark. Well, you'd be a fool to think it was the Gospel of Mark that we have, right? An irregular narrative. Come on now. Mark's a regular narrative, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not very well. It's not good, but I mean, it's a regular narrative. He mentions Matthew in a dialect of the Hebrews. Well, that's not the one we have. So, but no one really puts those puzzle pieces together. So too here, Polycarp or Clement might have a version of Paul or an echo of Paul, but it's not an attestation of the canonical text. It's just a Paul or a reference to Paul. And to my mind, unless he quotes Paul by name, or he uses some form of introductory remark like Goodacre, as it is written, I'm pretty careful into how he quotes things. Because I mean, even with Irenaeus, when he quotes from people, even if it's anonymously, he says, as someone said, right? He gives them that reference. But it doesn't appear to me that the other geezers do that. And I think that's again an issue. But again, I mean, let's assume Polycarp for a second. Justin knows Polycarp. Got to. I don't see how they don't come into some form of contact with another. So Polycarp knows Paul, but Justin doesn't. What? That raises more problems than it answers for those who believe that Paul is a one great united solid text by the beginning of the 2nd century, right? That's got to be confusing, and I have no answer to that. Even with Marcion, I think one of the reasons Justin doesn't use Paul is because he knows he's Marcion's. I think that's why he's so scared to use Paul. But you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, even if you're right, Polycarp mentions him, that doesn't mean he's got the canon.
Yeah, that is an interesting dilemma, isn't it?
It is. I mean, Justin basically ignores him, and while Polycarp may mention him and even mention letters by him, it doesn't mean that that's our canon, Paul, at all.
But also, again, what and this is the thing that I only throw this out on. I become a bit like canonical Paul here, to make my point in a sermon. Everywhere I went in Chicago at the North American Patristic Society, and everywhere I went at the British New Testament Society, and everywhere I went at the International Patristic Society in Oxford, I only brought up the same argument all the time, which was the resurrection, because I just think that's the cut and thrust, easiest one to conceptualize. If you're right and Polycarp knows Paul, why does he not even mention the resurrection? I just can't. I don't see how that happens. And then all of a sudden, in a post-Marcionite world, everyone's obsessed. That eventually there comes a point where the overwhelming probability is too much for me to bear.
Well, let me ask sort of a challenging question then. If our canonical Gospels and our canonical Paul are sort of coming into existence at the same time, why don't we see more gospel detail in canonical Paul?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think that's partly the case because the gospel has and the Paul has come up separately. So I think that because they've come up separately, it would be, in some sense, a big blunder of the redactors to try and cross-merge them, because people already know the text in some sense. I mean, like the Evangelion, Marcion's Gospel, and New Testament Paul, Marcionite Paul, also don't really have much of a crossover. And so, in terms of the narratives, so I think these texts are separate. That's why I think they're first century. That's why I think they're coming up.
So is it that their canonical Pauline redactor is unaware of those details?
No, I think he knows them. I think he knows Paul,
and he's sort of leaving them out of the version of Paul.
Well,
why would they leave out? Why would it seems to me there'd be all kinds of convenient detail in the Gospels for the traditional viewpoint, for the more Catholic viewpoint, and yet even in our redacted canonical Paul, we don't see much of those details, even very convenient details. As you point out, for example, the thrust on resurrection. Why don't we have more gospel material in canonical Paul? I
think that's why Acts is written. I think that's why Acts is written ex nihilo. And I mean that in every sense. I think that Acts is the attempt to bridge that gap. And I mean, because there's no doubt that I think that people know Paul, either, not through the canonical text, but through Marcion, and they know his thrust. I mean, I think Justin Martyr knows the cut of Paul's jib, and that he is the resurrection apostle, and that his text leaves them open to some difficulty. And that Acts then seeks to bridge that gap by placing what we all know about Paul, what's in the common knowledge, the common consensus. But what he does then is to put him under Peter, to subsume him into the story of the apostles in Acts, and then launch pad into Paul's own ministry. Now, again, this is speculation, but again, I think that it's something that we do all the time. I mean, I always think of political memoirs. I think of people like Tony Blair, and Tony Blair, when he left office here, did not have a particularly good rap because he went to war in Iraq. No thanks to Bush. And what's really interesting now, though, is that the way he's looked on is almost like a saintly figure, that he did great things. So when new texts are written about him, we don't hear much about some of the Iraq stuff that went on, or when he pops up and says we should give more money to the poor. Hey, look, no one's going to fight with you about giving more money to the poor, I don't think. But what about the atrocities you committed in Iraq? I don't know, man. So I think the same is happening here. I think that people don't like, the proto-Catholics like Justin don't like Paul. It's a problem for them. Irenaeus then says, or Irenaean schools then say, well, why don't we just fit him in? Why don't we keep the stories that everyone knows in the collective narrative? But write Acts as a thrust pad to put him under Peter, but he can still have his own story. And that's why Acts and the Pauline epistles are contradictory, because he has no idea what Paul got up to. And so he does know Paul, but my goodness, he's confused. Again, I'm not blaming Irenaeus solely here. Again, that's conjecture, but I mean, that would be my best guess. I'm sure Marcus and Mark have other better ideas than I. But I think that's certainly one position. But I'm happy for you to tear that down immediately.
Well, I'm just here to ask. I'm not here to tear down.
No, because I think I like the cut and thrust. Ultimately, right? We only find out new things that are true if we have a go at each other.
That's
right?
True.
Really.
That's true. Well, okay. Let me ask another then, sort of challenging question. It is our canonical redactors who add the co-authors, like Timothy, right? And why, if you were using Paul as authority and you're trying to rescue Paul as authority, why would you dilute? And I love the way Marcus kind of jujitsus me on that. He says, well, the whole point is to dilute Paul's authority. Then why not do it consistently? Say, give a co-author Galatians to your new, expanded edition of
Ephesians
Galatians.
and the pastorals.
Well, I think that the pastorals are a separate case altogether.
Yeah.
They're a separate case altogether. Because it's a weird thing there, because it seems to me that almost that Polycarp and the pastorals have a relationship as well. And therefore, in some ways, the pastoral epistles might be later than Paul, but earlier than canonical Paul. Right? I think there's a possibility of that in my mind because of the relationship Polycarp has with them. But putting that to one side and remaining with the 10, because I think that he does add a lot more co-authors in than one would expect if there was no co-authors entirely. But I think, why not do it to all of them? I think in some ways that's a difficult question to answer, because if there were no co-authors added, but you wanted to dilute Paul, then why would you not say there were? I think that's just a difficult question, because it can be spun in both directions. One thing we can say is that it is the trend of all or most of early Christian texts to add extra characters into the story. That is a almost universal trend. I mean, we think of Thecla, for example, in Paul's Journeys, or we think of the what I would call the fan fiction that spins off around Barnabas, or around even Timothy in the pastorals, or for Ignatius, he then ends up meeting people like Fronto and Crocus, and again the stories get bigger and bigger. And so I don't think it's just about a dilution of Paul. I also think it's about a claiming of authority for other Christian groups, right? So it's not just about getting rid of Paul's narrative. I don't think it's all about the dilution of Paul, actually, quite like Marcus does. I think that, like I say, some of it is to do with, I've started a church, actually. I've started a church in London, England. And do you know, I don't have any form of apostolic reference I could put here, because, an apostle never made it to England. Who did? Sosthenes. Yes, he came to London, did Sosthenes, and he started a wonderful church. And did you know that he co-wrote Romans? Right, you see, I think there's a part of that as well. It's creating legacy, and it would be, I think, also very clever, because it also binds other texts together. So I see Timothy in one, and then I see Timothy in Acts, and then I see Timothy somewhere else. So Timothy is bound then immediately 4 letters together. Then Titus has done the same. Now, what we have, Marcus calls them hyperlinks between these texts that seeks to just pin one to another. I think that's probably a part of it as well. So maybe it's a bit of the dilution. Maybe it's a bit we're trying to create further dynasties and apostolic traditions, but also it binds texts together in a way that you can't do otherwise.
So with particular examples you just used there, Timothy and Titus, it actually gives a boost to the pastorals themselves. Here's Paul corresponding with them.
Yeah, and again, I also think hypothesis. I think Timothy and Titus probably do exist. I don't think they're fictional characters, but I think they're characters that are not original to the story. So again, I get a lot of criticism for this, and accused of being a Catholic bias scholar. But I do think that most or many of these characters do in some way exist. right? I think they do. And the reason why they get thrust into the story when they've got no part in it is because they have some props. So, I mean, Thecla's probably an anomaly to that. I don't think that necessarily that she was real. But certainly these first century characters, I think that a bit like some of the early Greek figures, or even the Old Testament figures or Roman figures become mythologized. But I do think they once existed in some form. And then narrative springs up, they become useful, they become convenient for people to plop in where they want them to. Well, that's fantastic. That works doubly, because nothing is so convincing as to tell people part of the truth. I think if you tell lies, that's a lot harder. But if you tell part truths, that's a lot easier and a lot more convincing, and you can place it somewhere.
Well, here's a more detailed question that might be regarded as challenging. If your design is to put Paul's letters as far back in the past as you possibly can, why would you, at the end of Romans, include someone like Erastus, who, from what we know, can be confirmed as a second century figure?
Well, I do think that people make mistakes all the time, right? And so, I mean, Luke does it. I mean, Luke's gospel's garbage. I mean, and let's be honest, we all know that Luke is trying to be first century, don't we? Right? No one's under any illusion there. It's trying its hardest, but it's full of nonsense. And the reason for that is for the same reason that you and I make mistakes in our books today, is that, okay, we've got the help of the internet, which makes it probably easier, depending on which source you read. Stay away from Reddit. But we can't be perfect all the time. And I think Eusebius makes this mistake. I think that Origen makes these mistakes. Tertullian makes these mistakes. I think we sometimes over egg how good these guys are to the point where we expect perfection, when actually 90% of the time they're very good. 95% of the time they're pretty good, but that 5% of the time they're just a bit trashy. And again, the middle recension of Ignatius, again, I keep going back to it, is the great example of this as well, because he is trying to make Ignatius early first century, and yet exclusively puts in second sophistic Hadrianic concepts. Think, if he's writing in 110 and is killed under Trajan, what does he know about Hadrian? But he ballses it. And again, I don't think we can expect anything different then from our other friends. The expectation of perfection will often blind us to
years ago, we're talking about a largely illiterate audience to whom this might be read. They're probably not particularly well informed about historical detail.
Well, that's not changed no matter what year it's written. I mean, don't worry about that.
We pretend as though our literacy level in the West has gone up a bit.
I tell you, I mean, I think we're more confused now about the second century than we were when they were reading it live. But I mean, but I mean, I hope I get that across. Is like the idea that in the same way that we could expect to know everything about what year is it now, 2026. Man, what do we know about the First World War? I mean, generally, most people, what do we know about the First World War? And that's with the internet, that's with ChatGPT, that's with every resource at our disposal. And even now, people make the most basic of mistakes. And so when you then have a lack of manuscripts, you then have a lack of sources, I think you can forgive people for misplacing a person or a date. I just don't see why that's such a big deal to us, that we're so surprised by it. Anyone that makes that accusation, I'd say, look at your own life. You never made a mistake? I don't know, dude.
Well, I've made plenty.
Yeah, I mean, I've written absolute crap in journal articles and been slandered for it. So I'm not gonna attack our canonical redactors. I mean, in many ways, I think the canonical redactors are genius, because I mean, this is the logic of this, right? For 2,000 years, they have convinced everybody. I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, I think if you'd have told them that at the time, they might not have believed you. And it's only with the advent, I think, of computational linguistics and, well, or before computational linguistics, the Control F button, as Marcus and I used to using before meeting Mark Bilby, that we've come to see some of these discrepancies. And there's always been hinted at, particularly in a post-romantic era. Once you get past some of the romantic scholars of the 19th century. As we move through the 20th century, I mean, Harnack is starting to smell a fish straight away, you know, and others before him, to be fair. But people say this doesn't smell right. There's something not quite good here. And actually, we may even take that further. I mean, you know, I think that even Eusebius notes some problems and tries to gloss them quite considerably. Because, I mean, he's getting conflicting attestations of bishops, or who's a bishop when and how and all the rest of it. And so he just goes, right, whitewash that. The answer is this. But even in his book, I mean, even in his text, he makes mistakes. And so that's one author writing one text that we're fairly sure he does in church history. He gets confused about who's the bishop, second bishop, or third bishop of Antioch. He doesn't know. So I can forgive that, I think.
And his whole concern is history and pinning it down. So.
He got one job.
He's got one job to start pinning this down for us. Right.
Yeah, it's tough. So yeah, I don't see any problem with historical inaccuracies or contradictions. I just think it's what happens when even one person writes one text, never mind 3 or 4 or 5 people are writing them 100 years after the event.
If I were to ask, what is your best evidence that the canonical version of Paul is Hadrianic in period, as opposed to much earlier, as most scholars say, what would your answer be?
So that's a different question from showing that Marcion is first. That's a different question. Well, I don't. So in some sense, I don't think I can prove a negative, right? I can't say. I'm always conscious to say that it definitely isn't first century, and no one can ever prove that at the end. What would I think a better question maybe to ask is, what would convince me that it's first century? Because that's the question we should always be asking ourselves. What would convince me that X is true? Unless it's like, is there a teacup behind the moon? What would convince me that it's first century? It'd be one of 3 things. And we'll put it in least likely to most likely order. A manuscript. Nah, not gonna happen. A discovery of another text that was attesting Pauline theology, or his words exactly, that was early. And again, I don't just want like, here's an echo or allusion to Paul, because I hate those phrases, and B, because again, that doesn't show me that Paul is earlier than Polycarp or than Ignatius or than Clement. It just shows me that one is having a direct literary relationship with another. So, for example, let's say we do find the prize gift that is Papias, and Papias says, "Oh yeah, I remember when John was telling me about Paul. He was right. Git. They met in." Wherever they met, and they did his nut in and whatever, that would be enough, I think, to convince me. But lastly, I think that to show me that the canonical texts were first century, you would have to show me they were pre-Marcionite. And the reason why is because I think that we can definitely attest that Marcion is 140-ish, and I do not think that Marcion wrote these texts, therefore they must predate him. So let's just be slightly presumptive here and say that they're written in 120 or collected. Let's say collected in 120 or 130. Then they must be first century if Marcion is second, right? If Marcion is after, and Marcion has them in 140, and Marcion didn't write them because they were redacted, then for that whole process to happen, the canonical version must be first century. That's a lot of ifs and buts to get us there. But that would be what it took, I think. So yeah, it's a long way.
So it's a question, though, where we place the burden of proof and where we should properly place the burden of proof.
Yeah, and so if you watch any of my videos, Marcus and I actually have semi-different language, I suppose, if you push us to be precise, right? I think Marcus and Mark would both say, 100% this is the first. This is earlier. And my argument is slightly more nuanced, partly because I'm more cautious of being wrong, because I've always got imposter syndrome. My argument is slightly different, which is that the earliest version of the Pauline epistles that I can currently show is Marcion's. And there's a real subtle nuance there, right? It's like, I'm not saying it definitely is the first. I'm just saying it's the earliest that I have evidence of now. And yeah, like I said, that's partly because I'm a big wuss and refuse to be committal.
Something I've been reminding people a lot recently, looking at the co-author thing from a different angle, is I look at the co-authors as not people that the historical Paul knew, but people that were collaborators to create the canonical epistles as we have them, or at least most of them, because they're not co-authors in all of them. And I think Clement's letter, not knowing any of their names, is fascinating. Clement never names any of them. Tertius, Sophanes, Timothy, and Silas, they're never named by Clement. Clement doesn't say much about Paul. And that's a point that I've made a lot, is that because these people weren't part of the story yet.
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows these people, right?
Yeah.
And again, I do think they probably existed in some sense, but I just don't think that it
Right.
matters. I think another beautiful, again, if we can trust it, is Papias' fragment on John, when he says, well, and I surmise here, I paraphrase, well, I have sort of a Gospel of John, but I'm not really asked because John's here. Now, the great Papias Bishop of Hierapolis wouldn't have said that quite, but you get the point, is that I do think that texts are slightly a secondary to them, particularly while the figures are around, and the particularly secondary figures who aren't canonical, or sorry, from a canonical period, let's say is a better phrase, or direct descendants, i.e. the Apostles or Paul. I mean, who cares? I mean, even Ignatius, nobody cares. I mean, literally nobody cares about Ignatius. I mean, Polycarp mentions him maybe once or twice, but Justin's not bothered by him. Irenaeus quotes him anonymously. Origen sort of bothers a little bit to quote him twice. I mean, who cares? So the idea that somehow, Timothy and Titus or Sosthenes or whoever else, like, well, yeah, they're not apostles. And even for Marcion, I mean, take Marcion. He doesn't give much of a toss about the apostles. They're just some morons in a story who don't really get the gist of this. And Paul, Paul's all about, that's the man. He knows. He's the apostle. So I think that we have some ideas in our head about what we would expect to be the case, and we place them back in history. And I think that's unfair. I think that's unfair to expect that. But I mean, I agree with you. I think Clement probably does know them, but why would he mention them? I think Ignatius probably does know them. Why would he care? Particularly in a world where, again, in a fractured world, in a world that isn't constantly talking to one another. If I'm in Antioch and you've converted in Western France, brother, I'm probably dead before I've even heard your name, right? And so I think that's another point. I mean, do I even think that someone like Clement is known by a mad Christian somewhere in southern Judea? I don't know. Maybe not. Right? So probably not. So I want to be really careful in my expectations. I'm trying my best not to thrust what I think should be the case on the ancient world, because I simply do not know that much. I mean, even conversations between Pliny and Trajan take ages to happen. And these are the richest people in the empire. And if it's taken them a long time to have conversations and transmit stuff, then I don't think we should expect these Christians to have the fastest communication routes either, even though there are some wealthy ones among them.
So I'm going to take this super chat real quick. JC, thank you for your super chat. Who does Dr. Bull think was the canonical redactor? An individual or school? What are the main fingerprints or lexicological signals?
So it cannot have been the work of one person. The sheer volume of material is too big, and the job they did was actually really good. Marcus often likes to belittle canonical Paul and the redactor of canonical Paul. I think that's sort of fairly funny, and I agree with him in part. But I do think that, again, the job they did was so cohesive in formulating a narrative that it formed a church. Now several churches, but at least for a small time, maybe some canon that everyone agreed upon. So when I think is the easiest answer. When is post Justin, pre 200? So that gives you about 30-40 years. And the reason why I give that period is because it's quite clear that Justin does not have the full foundational texts of a canon, of the canon we know, because again, there's no unified canon in the early church. That's a complete anachronism. But Origen does seem to know it all. Tertullian does seem to know stuff. Even Irenaeus is getting there, right? So it's happening sometime in that space, in that place. As for where, I can't really see it happening anywhere outside of Rome. It's the place where all the big fellas are, all the big hitters. Irenaeus is certainly the cut and thruster of that period, and it might happen under him or through his followers. Again, it can't have been the work of one man. So that's probably the where. As for the lexicographical and the grammatical and all those other sorts of things, there's so much and that we could look through. From the function words, things like prepositions and conjunctions and what we call adverbs, whatever, all the way through to these big theological concepts, or even metaphors and analogies like combative imagery being present in one or medical imagery being present in the other. I would say that perhaps the biggest thing would be what I alluded to earlier without going into great detail, which would be the purpose of the text. There's no doubt in my mind that the canonical text was made to be read to people. It was set up so that your bishop or your priest could sit with you on a Sunday or maybe a Saturday night, whatever, and tell you the story of Paul, his theology, his thoughts, and his words. And as I sit, actually, just yesterday in Mass, they read, apart from 2 Corinthians, that is not present in the Marcionite text. And as I was listening, I thought, this does speak well. It sort of comes across well as a preach. But if I sit and read Marcion's text, unless you're thinking pretty hard as a scholar, as someone who wants to meditate and contemplate and respond, it doesn't hit the same muscles. It's not quite the Billy Graham, 50,000 people in a stadium attitude. So that'd be the biggest thing. The difference in purpose, even more than going into than the lexicographical style going into detail now. The purpose of the text seems to have fundamentally shifted. And when you read them side by side, that's mad. I cannot recommend enough. Even if you want to go the free version on Zenodo, there's a version that's out there for free. It's all beautifully formatted. It's not quite the current reconstruction that we have. There's lots of verses now missing in the current version. But if you just want a free one, just read it side by side and be like, whoa. These are different texts.
Somebody was saying in the live chat earlier, this always annoys me every time I see this. Paul's letters don't know the destruction of the temple. Well, I'll be referring to canonical Paul when I bring this up. But in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, the wrath of God has come upon the Judeans in past tense. It happened. Is that going to happen, or that Paul thinks it's going to happen in his co-authors? It happened for them. And 1 Corinthians, I often forget where in 1 Corinthians, but it's there. It talks about don't worship God in buildings subject to the flames, and the temple is inside you. The temple is within you. So you don't need a physical temple to worship God. So to me, these are post-70 rationalizations in light of the temple's destruction. I don't see how wrath of God happened before 70. That doesn't make sense to me.
And the spiritual temple business in 1 Corinthians, that's even in the Epistles, correct?
Which one?
The spiritual temple. We are the temple. Jesus is the cornerstone. We don't need one subject to the flames. That's in the Epistles, Marcion's version of Paul, right?
Yeah, but 1 Thessalonians 2:16 is not. Is not.
Right.
It doesn't it still have sorry to interrupt, I was just briefly adding. Doesn't the Marcionite version have the Jews being blamed for Jesus' death, but just the wrath of God part's missing?
No, the current reconstruction is all of verse 16 is gone. So it has the same things you suffered by thy co-tribesmen, your own, as they themselves by the Judeans. Okay, so it does have that bit. Them who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophet their own. So yeah, it has them that they killed him. But then not verse 16. But I mean, if I just may speak to that, I mean, it's like it was what we spoke about earlier. If I'm writing a text and I want to place it in a space, and I'm writing about, let's say, Winston Churchill, I don't include the iPhone, right? And I'm careful how I do that. And yeah, we can make mistakes or whatever, but I just think that's such a confuddling idea to me. It's a projection about what we want to see in text sometimes, rather than what's actually there. But either way, in Marcion it's not present, so make of that what you will.
But the fact
that is interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Jim.
the fact that even in Marcion's version of Paul, well, we've got a spiritual temple now, and in effect, Jesus is our replacement salvation mechanism. And physical temples are downright dangerous, being subject to flames. Would that suggest to you, Jack, that was written after the destruction of the temple?
The Marcion?
Yeah, I mean, even in the apostolist version of 1 Corinthians, we have Jesus as the temple substitute. And in fact, physical temples are downright dangerous because they're subject to the flames.
Well, but Marcion's view of the temple wouldn't have been particularly positive anyway, right? So I suppose, he wouldn't have given a flying monkeys about whether he had one or not.
Insofar as it was received by Marcion and could be pre-Marcion, or would you say that this is a Marcionite 2nd century edition?
Well, no, I mean, now you're really getting into the debates that happen behind the circles in the patristica meeting house, because who we believe wrote what is a big contention point between Mark and I, so I don't know who wrote this. So again, being classic, I'll sit in the middle between granddad and dad as they fight. I'm saying things like, well, Paul wrote some of it, we don't know which bits. And whereas Marcus is still sort of semi of the opinion that Marcion had a hand in this, and so this could be, according to Marcus, a Marcion fiddle. Whether Paul wrote it or not, Marcion may have fiddled with it afterward. Hence why there's an apparent uniformity between the letters, including and sometimes the Evangelion.
Well, let me ask you this. Just as a sheer educated guess, as someone who's gone over this material carefully, if you had to say, this is the most likely bit in Paul to be 1st century, sounds like the oldest idea or ideas in Paul, what would that be?
That's not a question I've thought of, partly because I don't want to.
Well, you don't have to. I have no gun to your head.
What do I think would be earliest? I think that probably things to do with the Jews, maybe, because I think that, to my mind, there is a progression towards talking about the Jews, and it goes through some stages. I think it goes through. Then again, but then obviously that I take that back actually, because then you end up in a difficult place with some of the Apostolic Fathers. I don't know. I would have to think about that, and I bet you Mark and Marcus have great ideas straight away. I do not.
Well, thank you. I mean, I just was asking out of the blue, and so
no. I'm gonna plead the fifth.
Okay.
I don't know if you can in the UK, but I'm gonna try.
Yeah, I think either way, regardless of which edition really is first, I think a big hang up for the early dating of Paul's letters has to do with just Clement just blissfully being totally ignorant of a 10 or 13 letter collection of Paul's letters. Scholars have to go through hoops trying to read Clement and say, oh, Clement's quoting a piece of 1 Thessalonians, or over here he seems to know Romans, but he just doesn't really know them because it has quasi parallels. And Jack, you mentioned this earlier, where Clement has parallels, but also has contradictions to the letters. One of the ones I have fun pointing out often is the 7 bonds of Paul and 1 Clement. Okay, so Paul was in prison 7 times, but that's not in our epistles. That's not in Acts. And then Clement just never mentioning Paul's vision. We're just not going to talk about Paul's vision. That's weird. He's leaving all kinds of little stuff and big stuff out.
What's strange is
to
that
me,
Pauline themes in First Clement, but it's hard to say that he's using Paul's letters. I mean, he says that he refers to a letter by Paul, but on the other hand, he says Paul made it all the way to the farthest west, and he can't be relying on Romans because Romans is Paul is simply saying, "I intend to get there." Clement seems to think he made it there.
Yeah. That one letter business is picked up by a very rogue fellow called Roger Parvou. And Roger Parvou argues that Apelles also used one letter of Paul, which was 1 Corinthians. And so because when they talk about Apelles, it says he had 1 gospel and a letter in his New Testament. So I mean, maybe there is a tradition of having 1 Paul and epistle, and 1 Corinthians would make a lot of sense for that. But I'm really cautious. Gosh, I'm the man who's full of questions and no answers. I'm really cautious around 1 Clement. There's no way in my mind that it's a singular text. It's a composite text. I think the lexic grammatical data bears that out. Also, who's sitting down and writing a letter that long in the ancient world? Ain't nobody got time for that. The Corinthians aren't going to read that nonsense. Come on now, think. So I am cautious about his dating, and so what I'd like to do, although it might not happen until I'm 70, is some constructive research on that, because you got to remember that all of our understanding of the Apostolic Fathers comes essentially from like 4 people at the end of the 19th century who have a load of romantic nonsense in their head, and chief among them, the prince of the loonies, is J.B. Lightfoot, and we've relied on him for a century and a half now, and he is proven to be demonstrably wrong on many of the things that he has said on Polycarp and Ignatius. I am sure if I open up him on 1 Clement, he is also demonstrably false again. So I'm happy to talk about Clement, and I'm happy to use him as evidence, but I remain cautious about which bits were written and how. Again, some of it might have been Clementine. Other bits might be part of our late 2nd century hoo-ha. Because everyone else seems to have gone through that, right? I mean, again, the Didache seems to have gone through it, right? Ignatius and Polycarp, I can show, have gone through it. And so already there's 3 of the Apostolic Fathers who have gone through some form of manipulation and tampering. And I doubt that, and 2 Clement, well, we all know that 2 Clement's got a load of hassle in it. So I think that 1 Clement might release itself as well to have those as well. Perhaps exempt from this. I mean, maybe the letter to Diognetus and letter of Barnabas, maybe they might be exempt from such tampering. But again, I don't know. They'd require some looking at. But like I say, if we've got at least 3 of the Apostolic Fathers held to ransom, I see no reason why the others might also fall into that category.
And when you look at the chronological arguments, because I remember looking at some of this in Marcus's book, the English translation, and that is the chronological arguments for the early dating of Paul's letters are just really poor. And one thing is, I remember when I brought John Kloppenborg onto the show 3 years ago. I think it was 3 years ago. We were talking about the Erastus inscription. That's about when it happened, or a little while before that, when the Erastus inscription was redated to the 2nd century. Oh, well, it just can't be the same Erastus. So, no, it is. It's just the dating of the epistles are off. And when you put all that together, You got a wrath of God, 1 Thessalonians. You got the buildings being subject to the flames in 1 Corinthians. You just put all that together, assemble all that together. And to me, it just forms a picture that you have people living in a later time period, several people living in later time periods in canonical Paul. What little archaeological, so-called archaeological data being used to show that Paul was earlier, show that he's later. At least the canonical edition is later. And I know you're being cautious about 1 Clement, but Clement apparently being super ignorant, at least to my mind, doesn't help the cause either, regardless of when 1 Clement's dated. I'll leave it there.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I suppose I leave the viewer with this, is that we are basically entering in, I think, to a Nag Hammadi Qumran time for New Testament scholarship, where the work of Marcus and Mark, and we should also add in here Jason Badoon and Matthias Klinghardt and many others, is now has to be reassessed. And irrespective of one's conclusions, the questions still have to be asked. And I'm grateful for you two to bear us out, even if you don't agree, because I've been up and down. Including, I mean, Marcus has talked to John Glockenborg loads of times, and I've talked to scholars in all these places I mentioned. And all we're doing is, I think, at this point, although we have what we have as answers, we think, all I'm open to do at this point is just to ask questions and see what the response is from people who have published relentlessly the same thing for 50 years. And if they have no answer for that, then they've got to go find one. Happy to hear it, but they've got to go find one.
And just remind everybody real quick before we close, I have the link to purchase the Apostolos Reader's Edition in the description below in the pinned comment, as well as the Zenodo free version. So if you want to get that instead, that'll be down there too. And Patristica is tagged in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comments too. If you haven't subscribed to Jack Bull's YouTube channel, Patristica, you can do so now.
We do really boring stuff on our channel just to try and really sell it. We are boring. Like, there's none of this nice thumbnails, none of the pretty setup that Jacob does. It is dull, dude. And we go through word by word through these reconstructions, and try and do that meticulously. And it's always with Marcus and Mark giving you all of the data and none of the fun. But if you're into that sort of thing, you do you. Come and join us. We'd love to have you. That's. I was never a man for PR, but I am for scholarship. So come and join us.
All right, Jack and Jim, thank you both for joining me today.
And thank you, Jack. It's always charming to chat with you.
Pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.